Hello Horror Hounds, welcome back to my A to Z of horror. In this instalment we find Detective Lucas McCarthy plagued by the traumatic memories of capturing mass murderer Max Jenke, and watching it you'll be plagued by an overwhelming feeling of deja vu and recycled ideas. Surely witnessing Jenke's death on the electric chair will provide some form of closure. Don't count on it when we find out that H is for the horror show. Or is it House 3? My A to Z of horror is inspired by, some would say stolen off, Jambo Shango and Randy Mole's own excellent A to Z of horror. I will direct you in the description field below to a link to their entry for H, another fun, rompy, effects-driven movie, Hatchet. But for now, we're going to be talking about House 3, or the horror show, as it's known in the US. Is this part of the House franchise at all? The title says so. The tone says absolutely not. From the outset, it's clear that this is an entirely different proposition to the uneasy sort of poltergeist-light mixture of horror and comedy that informed House, and the far goofier, more family-friendly proto-Jumanji romp of House 2. Depending on where on the internet you choose to read about House 3, the producers decided to build this as the horror show in the US because it deviated so wildly in tone from the first two parts, or it was billed as House 3 outside the US for brand recognition following a poor reception in the US as the horror show, or foreign financiers provided upfront financing for House 3, which they were delivered in their own territories, even though Sean Cunningham and co had actually made a movie called The Horror Show. And in the audio commentary, Sean Cunningham says that this is a House movie and it was always intended to be a House movie. Take your pick, any of the above, or make up your own. If you really want to fall down a movie title rabbit hole, then Google how The Horror Show or House 3 became the 7th in a series of movies in Italy under the banner La Casa, or The House, after Sam Raimi's Evil Dead was released in Italy as La Casa, and Evil Dead Part 2 was released as La Casa 2, or La Casa 2, The House 2. The Italians are never shy on jumping on brand recognition and milking the success of one thing for another. Look at Zombie Flesh Eaters, which got billed in Italy as a direct sequel to George Romero's Dawn of the Dead because that did good business. So yeah, there are 7 movies in the La Casa franchise in Italy, starting with Sam Raimi's Evil Dead and ending with Sean Cunningham's The Horror Show. Go figure. I think probably the take home from this should be, let's not worry necessarily about what it's called, and let's talk about whether it's any good. So from now on in this video, I'm just going to refer to it as The Horror Show. If you haven't seen The Horror Show, I don't think I'm telling tales outside of school if I tell you that Jenke's execution on the electric chair doesn't exactly take, and he sets about revenging himself on Lucas McCarthy by invading his dreams, warping the reality of his world, and threatening his family. This was a number of films around the same time to feature a killer that survives the electric chair to become a supernatural threat. In 87, Prison; 88, The Chair; in 1990, a year after this film, The First Power with Lou Diamond Phillips; and as well as The Horror Show in 1989, of course, Wes Craven's Shocker, which came out only a few months after The Horror Show. As a creation, Max Jenke is clearly a Freddy wannabe. To be fair, Wes Craven purposefully moulded Horace Pinker in the image of Freddy for Shocker, not unreasonably hoping to create a franchise character that he actually retained the rights to, because he didn't have the rights to Freddy. That must have stung. The Horror Show is such a weird riff on Shocker and Nightmare on Elm Street combined that if I were Wes Craven, I would be pissed off. I know that The Horror Show was released first, but that doesn't mean an enterprising producer with a history of ripping off Mario Bava for the first two entries in his Friday the 13th movie series, isn't capable of turning around a cheap film with a similar premise to a film he knew his old colleague was developing. I'm not saying Sean Cunningham definitely did this. I'm saying I wouldn't be surprised if I found out that he had done it. The similarities between Craven's then current project Shocker and his most famous creation, Freddy Krueger, are blatant. The tagline for the horror show is, "You'd rather be on Elm Street." Now you can make up your own punchlines here, but off the top of my head I'll suggest, I thought I was on Elm Street, and yes. Unlike the Nightmare on Elm Street movies, there are no real rules to the horror show. It starts with a flashback that turns out to be a nightmare, actually a nightmare within a nightmare. And then Genki meat cleavers Lucas in the chest and he wakes up properly. Later that dream wound becomes a scratch that starts to bleed and then grow, which makes no sense since Genki was still alive when that dream happened, and they are literally applying Nightmare on Elm Street dream. Like if it happens to you in the dream, it happens in real life here, but without any internal logic. That's one of the film's flaws. Genki's powers are never defined and never restrained. You can sum up Freddy in one sentence. If you fall asleep and he kills you in your dream, you die in real life. That's the power of Nightmare on Elm Street. With Genki, literally anything can happen, and anything can also be undone with the wave of the hand. If you're left scratching your head at the end of this film, wondering, what happened? Why are they still alive? What's this? What was? You won't be alone. Characters' deaths are undone at a stroke. Which means that even though the horror show is an FX-driven gore fest, it's also weirdly kind of victim-free and relatively bloodless. I will say this though, the threat to the family is well done. Because the family unit, you can actually root for them. They're not just a succession of cannon fodder for Genki to cleaver his way through. You really do like seeing Genki mess with Lucas, played by Lance Henriksen, and you kind of root for the family. Rita Taggart is game in a thankless task of wife and mother, given a little action towards the end of the film. The kids, Bonnie and Scott. Bonnie, the daughter, is played by Dee Dee Pfeiffer, and I really like her in this. I wish she'd done more in general. She's really good in this, and she's absolutely scrumptious in Vamp. Aaron Eisenberg plays the son, Scott. Now, I love him as Nog in Deep Space Nine. Probably the best Star Trek TV series. But what the hell is his character about here? He scams companies for free stuff by saying he's found thumbs in their products in a weird subplot in this movie that really doesn't have a place here, and then also caps off the movie, ending on a tonally weird sort of group laughter that reminds me of the freeze frame end credits at the end of every episode of Police Squad. And what the fuck are his Olivia Newton-John style cut-off gym tops all about? Yeah, I know it was the 80s, and I know some 80s fashion got a little hinky, but I was there, not that hinky. Truly it's the leads that give this film its juice. Brian James is the bad guy Max Genki, clearly having an absolute blast throughout. Get used to his sort of psycho Bugs Bunny laugh though. You'll be hearing it a lot. A lot. Lance Henriksen is performing at an intensity level above and beyond the call of duty for the material he's given to work with. And I need to give a final shout out to the internal affairs guy who interrogates Lucas. After Genki's apparent death by the electric chair, Lucas gets framed for a couple of Genki's supernatural murders, and naturally internal affairs get curious. The guy that interrogates Henriksen is hilarious, truly illustrating that there are no small parts, only small actors. I want an entire franchise of that IA guy investigating cops tied up in supernatural murder cases. I need it to happen so badly. But I can't entirely hate on this movie. I'm watching it through nostalgia goggles. I think of it as a Fangoria movie. I watched this back in the days when I was reading Fangoria magazine. Back when you found out about upcoming horror movies by reading Fangoria magazine, and they would do 5-6 page articles about the effects team working on this next cool movie, and it always looked like it was going to be the greatest freaking horror movie ever made, and then the MPAA or the BBFC would get their hands on it, and all of the amazing stills that used to pour over on the magazine just weren't in the film. There are great effects in the horror show, especially Jenke's execution scene. I mean, it's flat out brilliant, easily the highlight of the movie. The talking turkey, I'm not entirely sold on that. Even though the Arrow Blu-ray comes with the American theatrical version and what's billed as the uncut European version, really don't believe the hype. The film is still cut. Either I'm remembering scenes that were never in the film based on stills I saw from Fangoria, or I'm suffering some crazy Mandela effect where I'm actually from an alternate universe where I saw a version of the horror show where Lance Henriksen's big effect sequence where the cleaver wound opens up and he sees and handles his own heart was intact. Either way, the uncut European version I believe has more effects and slightly more gore in it than the US theatrical version, which I've never seen, and I really don't see the point in watching. The point of this movie kind of is the effects. There's an extra on here interviewing the special effects guys and all the work they put into it, and they were saying, you know, these effects movies are our business cards, they're our show reels to prospective new clients to show what we can do, and when our stuff doesn't make the movie, it really hurts, it bums us out. So I think the intention always was to go hard on the horror show, and I think maybe nowadays they could get away with it. Going hard back then in the 80s when the MPAA was cutting things to shreds, I mean, there are still episodes in the Friday the 13th franchise that have essentially been muted and the footage lost, and we'll never really see what was intended. I have a soft spot for the horror show. It's a big bag of dumb fun. But as I say, Brian James is absolutely going for it. Lance Henriksen is going for it in his own focused, intense kind of way. One more scene with the IA guy would have absolutely made it for me. The undoing of some of the deaths right at the very end of the movie, I'm not really sure what that's all about. But if you're in the mood for a horror movie equivalent of a Big Mac, you could do a lot worse than the horror show. Next, we're going to go from the ridiculous to the sublime. And one of the movies I decided to do my A to Z of horror as an excuse to watch for the first time. As ever, I'm going to leave up for a few seconds a picture clue, and please join me for a gem of a film that I can't believe it's taken me so long to watch, when we discover that I is Thigh.